Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. And actually, at the weekend I was in Warsaw talking to a group of people at a conference, and sadly it was very underattended. So to come here and see a big auditorium is a welcome change and relief. I had a strange experience when I arrived at my hotel just a few hours ago. I said a few words in French, and maybe that was a mistake, because the lady on the reception then launched into a great long speech, and I only understood part of it, but I thought that what she was telling me was it couldn't be me because I had arrived the day before. And I felt like, I don't know if you've ever seen these French films set in Paris, starring Harrison Ford. You know, there's always a mix-up over identity. I thought I'd wandered into that. And now it gets worse, because I don't know if anyone was reading the title on the previous slide, but it's different from my actual title. It's almost as though there are two of me. And actually, the other title was better, so it looks like you've got the wrong guy. So anyway, until the real Rick Poynor turns up, I'm going to talk to you for a bit. And maybe all this sounds a bit kind of whimsical and personal, because I really do plan to approach this in a very different way from the talks that we've had so far, which are very academic, scholarly, measured. They give an overview of the situation. And I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to write from inside the situation, as it were. I'm going to talk about my own experience. I'm going to use myself as a kind of test subject, if you like. So on the one hand, I fear it might be rather self-indulgent, and I wouldn't normally do this, but there were certain things that the organizers said to me that led me to believe that this might be appropriate. So I'm calling my talk Graphic Design History, our subject, a mode of operation. And the mode of operation is my own mode of operation. It's what I'm doing, or what I think I'm doing, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And after this brief introduction, I'll show you a lot of things, because in a way, to talk about what I'm doing without showing the things is sort of, well, it's kind of strange, really. The proof of all this, the evidence, as it were, is in the things themselves. So I need to show them to you, but I hope it won't become repetitious. But that's the nature of the work, perhaps. So, right, as I say, mode of operation. I'm not presenting myself as any kind of model here. More an example, maybe, an example of what you might do. And if this has any kind of value in the context of the discussion here at the conference over 2 days, it's maybe just that, as example. We can talk all we like about what should happen when it comes to the writing of the subject, but in the end, you know, someone has to do the writing. Someone has to have a kind of career that involves a lot of writing. So that's what I want to talk about, how I've done that, because that is what I've done. However, I do want to say right at the start, I am not presenting myself as a design historian. I have written some design history, and when I've done it, I've tried to do it in a thorough and scholarly way. So in that sense, you know, I'm trying to be a good academic in those moments, but I would never say to someone, I am a design historian. I'm really not. I'm a writer, if you like, who somehow found the subject of graphic design, but the writing comes first. The desire to write comes before any subject matter. But in my case, a series of developments, which I won't go into, led me finally into graphic design, and I wrote about it for a while. I've actually broadened out from it again. So what I've engaged in is journalism and criticism and some design history writing, but I understand the design history to be really part of the journalism and criticism. It's all part of the same project. So the things I'm going to show and talk about are all to do with design history, but they actually run alongside a lot of other kinds of writing, which we deal with graphic design in other ways. So I'm writing about contemporary work, I'm writing in a more critical way or a more polemical way. And sometimes, you know, these various modes of writing overlap and converge on graphic design history. So I don't know what to call it. Is it a journalism of graphic design history? I just don't feel it's what we've heard about so far, particularly when Patricia was summing up that very interesting sounding day. And it was all quite abstract, and I got this vision of a sort of squad of serious design historians with PhDs who are going to do all this work. And my perspective on that has always been, I am your reader. I'm actually really interested to read it. So what I've done as a journalist always is watch out for the work people are doing. And in the past, I won't talk about it at length today, I've come to the conclusion that despite the big words, not much work actually gets done if by that we want to see, firstly, scholarly writing in journals. There was one year I monitored what the Journal of Design History was doing, and out of 16 articles they published, only one could be said to deal with design history. So, that's the leading British Journal of Design History. It contains almost no graphic design history. Unless they, changed a lot in the year or two since. So there's that side, and then there's the book side. I'm a reader and a buyer of books with a large library. It's how I do the work. So I'm always watching out for graphic design history books, and in English, because obviously that's what I'm talking about, in the English language, very few serious scholarly design history books get published from year to year. And while people here may say everything is getting much better, we're really on the move now, and perhaps you are in France, perhaps you are, I don't see it in English language writing, I really don't. I always remain to be persuaded and convinced, and I'll read and review the books when they arrive. So for me, like I say, these activities, these different types of writing are all bound together. They're not separate, and there are parts of my writing, for instance, about photography, which is increasingly important to me, has been for the last decade or more. I'm only going to touch on that only briefly, so that's a whole area I'm not looking at. I just don't want you to get the impression from what I'm going to show that, design history is my main thing. It's one of the things I write about. So I'm positioned, therefore, again, perhaps differently from other contributors, somewhere between academia and the profession of design. I do have a foot, at least, in academia. I teach from time to time on an occasional basis at master's level, principally at the Royal College of Art, but I go out to other places as well, and have done for a long time. And I know academics, and I respect academics, and I follow what academics are doing, so I feel I'm connected, but at the same time I'm outside. I wouldn't call myself an independent scholar either, this term that came up earlier. I love it, and maybe I've done some independent scholarship, but again it seems almost too specific, or when I say narrow, I don't mean limited, but sort of very focused in a way that I'm not. Nor am I completely of the profession, because I'm not a designer. In Britain, I guess I'm unusual in that respect, as being someone who isn't a designer, yet who is sufficiently interested in design to want to write about it, year after year after year. That remains quite unusual. I suppose the camp that I identify with, but I realize, maybe a kind of opening up a big pit for myself to fall into here, but I identify with an earlier generation of populist design historians, and we've already heard the name of Philip Meggs. He would be a classic example, in some ways the very best example we could give of this kind of figure, or still working, hugely prolific, Stephen Heller in some of the more serious history writing that he does. So, because he too has worked within journalistic frameworks, and if we were to, I'm not going to show slides today, but if we were to see slides of print magazine from the 80s and the 90s, when it was in its heyday, you would see a fabulous amount of historical writing was published by print. Meggs would do whole series on classic books, looking at one object in each article in great detail. So it wasn't the same as, scholarly writing that you would see in a journal, but, and this is the key point for me, it was historical writing which was knowledgeable and informed and well written, which was aimed at the profession. This whole idea that, again, we've heard earlier, that this writing exists to help shape design itself, to help shape designers. So, like it or not, if you want to do a lot of this writing, and I do, actually, you end up addressing the audience of designers. I'm not sure if I can get into too much detail about that right now, but it clearly is to do with the fact that there mostly isn't a broader public for our subject. So, that's what I identify with, someone who covers a lot of ground because they have a huge appetite and they have a lot of interests and they know a lot, and is not a single subject specialist or someone who concentrates on one area, in a very academic way and knows it in absolute depth and detail. No one knows more than them. They can start at the top and go all the way down. I sometimes go a fairly long way down, but I actually just don't want to live like that. I want to move across the land rather than drilling deep into the land. That's, it's just the kind of brain I've got, I suppose. So yes, I said this needs a big appetite to keep this up year after year because you're living by your wits. You've got to be alert and you're generating ideas and you're pitching ideas to publications and you're doing it over and over again and you seek to make money out of it. Of course, it has its dangers, and the obvious danger, which would be the immediate academic complaint, is it's not deep enough. It's superficial. Through not devoting enough time to the work, errors get made. And of course, when a super subject specialist deals with something written by a generalist, it's really easy to pick that generalist work apart. But I sometimes think, when that happens, I think, yeah, but are you really aware of the kind of, if we're talking about one of these populist historians, the fantastic cinematic sweep of their writing, the sheer amount they know of across a huge terrain, and that, that is real knowledge, because that allows you to make judgments about context that simply aren't available to someone who spends a lot of time in one place and doesn't move about. So again, I'm partly talking about the virtues and the benefits as well as the pitfalls of the journalistic lifestyle in a broader sense. You get to move around and see a lot. So I'm happy, I accept now that's, for all the academic dabbling I've done over the years, I'm in that category, and it suits me fine, because actually it's the only way you could conceivably make a living out of writing about something as relatively specialized as design without having a full-time or part-time position, that paid a lot of the money you need to live on. That actually you've got to write a lot to cover the field. So, like I said, I used the word earlier, my work, I think, is a kind of, I see it as a mosaic in a way. There's lots of bits, and over time they fit together and new possibilities occur to me through those juxtapositions. The reason for doing this, again, I feel I should give the reason. Why do this? Why live this way? Why do this? It's very simple for me. It begins with a love, an absolute undying love of images. I started by studying art history, and I was attracted to art history through drawing and painting, the two-dimensional image in particular. I also have a curatorial fascination with these graphic objects as exactly that, as objects. I like the things themselves. I like handling and dealing with the things. I like responding to the object. So this is very physical and very specific. It doesn't for me begin with abstractions. There may be ideas that arise from the objects, but they are grounded in the objects. And in that sense, if I were to live my life again, I quite fancy being a curator. It seems to me curators of fantastic collections who have continuous access, I have friends in this happy position in the archives, which Teal was talking about, the pleasure of working in the archive. I completely understand that. And in some ways, it does underpin what I'm doing. I'll go even further than that and come overall Barthesian and say, for me, this is a search for a kind of jouissance. There is absolute pleasure in doing this, and without that pleasure, why would you continue doing it month after month, year after year? That would be crazy. So, I'm coming clean about that. My primary influences, I do have to say, are not in design writing. It's not even in art writing. My influences, which shaped me from a very early age as a reader, come from film writing and music writing. And the reason for that is that both those areas, I'm sure it's true here, it's absolutely true in Britain, have big publics. They have big publics, they have big readerships, they have people who are passionate about film and music who are not filmmakers, not musicians. We know this. This is actually one of the problems with design, that it doesn't seem to have, or graphic design, enough people outside of design who are passionate about design. But still, I thought we can learn techniques from these other kind of writers who are both journalistic and historically conscious, and we can bring them into design writing. So that's what I tried to do from quite early on in the 80s, working on Blueprint and so on, which was a publication completely committed to that idea of a kind of intelligent writing for the general reader, or the generally knowledgeable reader. Just a couple of things to add, I guess, before showing a bit of work. That all of this is actually approached in quite a strategic way. So I'd like you to bear that in mind when I show you things, and it's the reason I'm showing you what I'm showing you, because in the end, it's about finding venues where you can continue to do the writing that you want to do. And if you can't find those venues, then you're out of business. This is again why I resist abstract discussions of the subject. To me, it always comes down to how is the person situated? How can they produce the writing? How can they fund the work they want to do? There are different ways of doing it, but this is the way I've chosen to do it in the journalistic marketplace, as it were. Again, that's completely, there's nothing remarkable about that whatsoever. There are thousands of writers like me pursuing the same sort of path in all kinds of subjects all around the world. And those film and music writers I talked about are a good example of that. Those, they're not academics, and yet somehow they get away with writing very seriously about their subject in, all sorts of publications. What I would like to do, I suppose, if I have to say what's my purpose here, what do I want to accomplish, I suppose it's to, and we've heard something about this already in a fantastic quote that Teal gave from Roger Remington, which is kind of what I was going to say too, but just in slightly different language. I would like to help, and that's all it is, help. I would like to contribute to the growth, the presence of, let's call it historical consciousness. And if our audience, by and large, is younger people, increasingly people shaped by the digital era, the era of the internet, the era, it sometimes seems, I have to say, of ever shorter memories, the present constantly erasing trace of the past so quickly. Well, I think in that culture, the issue of historical consciousness becomes critical, becomes absolutely vital, a necessity. Without it, as designers, we're going, as Remington was saying, we're going nowhere. You can't be an informed, reflective, intelligent designer without historical consciousness, and in fact, beyond that, you can't be an informed, intelligent, reflective citizen without historical consciousness. So that's why I think there is a sort of value in the kind of history writing that keeps returning to historical material and historical issues, but in more popular media. So not in academic journals read only by academics by and large, real specialists, real experts, but this discussion in the broader media. That's what I want to be part of, but it has to begin with design writing for the design profession. In fact, until that attains proper maturity, I think it's impossible to have that broader discussion of graphic design. Because where would the writers and the expertise and the sheer kind of writing talent come from if they weren't nurtured within design itself? So yeah, again, to round off on the historical consciousness, I suppose it's vital because it gives us benchmarks, it gives us points of comparison, it gives us precedents to draw on, so we're not perpetually wowed and amazed by something that's happened without understanding what its precedents are. And then, following on from that, it gives us what I would call a skeptical awareness. Now, in the English language at the moment, you don't hear people talk about skepticism much. It's like everything's become very shiny and happy and positive, and no one wants to sound like a skeptic, because that's like a negative, no-saying person. This is just nonsense, of course. Skepticism is simply about thinking rigorously for yourself, and when you hear something, as you're hearing me talking now, you test it rigorously, carefully, against other forms of evidence, other things you know. It's approaching things in a questioning way. So I would say a historical consciousness of what has happened in graphic design contributes to a skeptical, critical understanding of what we're doing now in graphic design. And so in that sense, I hope, and this is a word I like, I got it from Robin Kinross, the British publisher, editor, writer, design historian, where he talks about useful writing. Actually, isn't that the essence of it? What the writing we're talking about on the whole should be useful writing. And that's a very broad term, so I don't mean it needs to be instrumental, but just that it should have some application, some relevance. You can take something away and apply it to your own experience. Okay, let's look at some pictures, and I might whisk through some of this now. I'm already talking about this. This I accept is sort of what I'm doing. I'm playing the role of advocate of graphic design history for the benefit of a designer audience, occasionally for a wider public, but usually for designers. This is this book's second plug of the day. It is in English, of course. Perhaps there should be a French version. But I was very pleased to have a couple of pieces in there. I think it's a fantastic collection and vital in the way that it gathers together important material. And I'm not saying mine's important, but I've got this essay, which was mentioned earlier by Patricia, Out of the Studio, Graphic Design History and Visual Studies. I'm not going to go into this, but in a way, if you were to press me on, well, what do I think graphic design history should do right now, I'd probably stand by the arguments made there. I think an alliance needs to be made in with the departments which in the English-speaking territories, America in particular, Britain too, we would call either visual culture or visual studies as a way of getting design out of the studio. So graphic design is not just addressed to graphic designers. So that's a sort of longer-term strategy. I write a lot in Britain for a magazine called Creative Review, and I suspect my academic colleagues probably don't look at it very much because it's a monthly and it's for the profession and it has advertising in as well as design, and people have sometimes said, oh, it's a bit of a comic and disparaging. But the fact is, Creative Review, every issue, publishes 2 long reviews, and they're prepared to give you 1,000 words. And again, if you know anything about reviewing of design and book exhibitions, that's very unusual. 1,000 words and lots of images to explore a subject. And, as I say, we're addressing this broader design readership rather than just design historians. So I take stances in these reviews often because reviews are personal. Here I was criticising an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London because it didn't cover graphic design thoroughly enough in a survey of design. Books, I'll single out if they seem to have something to say about graphic design history. You may have seen this enormous book, box really, full of loose leaf sheets, published by Phaidon. It seemed to me a flawed and deeply problematic project, so I proposed this review. Because I know the magazine well, and this is what I mean about proceeding strategically, I've reached the point where I can anticipate things that they won't have thought of, because they've only got 2 reviews an issue, but which I believe should be covered. I can propose an idea, they trust me, and they'll let me do it. So that, I'm really using this in quite a deliberate way. Conferences too, I've written about this. Is actually print magazine in New York rather than Creative Review, but this is a response to an earlier graphic design history conference in London, the one that gave rise to the graphic design history in the writing book that we were just looking at. And again, I'm just taking a kind of probing or skeptical point of view, which is for the broader reader to try and pull the professional reader into a consideration of these issues. I'll also use these reviews as a way of advocating the merits of particular designers. Now, I know we're supposed to stop thinking about design heroes and styles and the idea of design history as a succession of styles and all of that. But the fact is, art was able to do this with the new art history in the late 60s, early 70s, to adopt new approaches because it already had a thorough history. It was in, much of the knowledge was in place. That is not true with design. Therefore, the rescuing of forgotten figures, a re-evaluation of their work, ultimately through monographs, seems to me an extremely valuable and necessary idea. So whenever a book like this comes out, in this case it was the American designer, or he's a German who went to America, called Will Burton, I leap on that as a chance to talk about it for these broader readerships. Same thing here with this figure, Dutch designer Jurjen Schroefer. Now this, if you don't know this book by Frederike Huygens, I really recommend you seek it out. As Dutch, I think there's a Dutch version and an English one, probably not a French one at this stage, but this again is a review of the book. I think it's one of the best works of graphic design scholarship about an individual and a body of work that I think I've ever seen. It is amazingly detailed and thorough, and is really a model of what we might hope to see in the near future if the subject is to develop. And every time a book like that comes along, it's a reminder of what we don't have at the moment, how unusual that kind of scholarship, real archival scholarship, she had full access to all his archive, how rare, and also when you get it, how revealing it is. So again, I'm talking about advocacy. This is a book about avant-garde American paperbacks. Again, I knew Creative Review wouldn't review it, so I proposed that. Same thing here, a book about countercultural graphics, one of my continuing interests. I rather doubted that Creative Review would pick this up, and they hadn't, so when I went along with the proposal, they said, yeah, do it. Even more unlikely in a way, I thought, will this be the time they say, no, we're not doing that? This is a magazine from the 1960s in Britain called Anarchy. It's precisely what it sounds like. It's an anarchist magazine, extraordinary, had these fantastic cover designs. And Hyphen Press, Robin Kinross's publishing company, produced a book about it. And again, I thought, how wonderful to get that into Creative Review. And they went for it. And sometimes, because I quite enjoy the arguments actually, and I like to be polemical, and I like to take positions, and I like to say things that other commentators or designers themselves aren't saying. So I've used Creative Review on occasion to do battle with the return of a kind of as it seems to me, insufficiently reflective neo-modernist thinking. And this was a book that came out, another monograph, pretty good one really, but about Unimark, this American company in the 60s, where they did indeed wear lab coats to work because they saw themselves as technicians. And so this was a critical reading and review of the book, and the way, in fact, it rather, to my mind, too credulously went along with the original modernist philosophy. And the same thing applies here, where Wim Crowell, of course. He's had an exhibition here in Paris in recent years. There's been ongoing celebrations about the man's body of work, exhibitions in London, birthday retrospectives, you name it. And at the time of a show at the Design Museum in London, I thought, I want to ask the question, what is it exactly that British graphic designers who idolize Crowell are getting out of his work? In what way are they reading or misreading his work? So again, these things, I know in writing this in Creative Review, I'm throwing this out at the Creative Review reader who's perhaps inclined to think, yeah, Crowell, wow, brilliant. My hero, etc. And I'm saying, but why would that be? I really will whisk through this because Teal's shown a few of the images I'm going to show already. But British graphic design history is obviously important to me because I'm British. But I'm interested in design as an aspect of cultural history and visual culture. And I really want to locate design within a broader cultural matrix. So, I'm interested at the point where design meets the book, or where it meets the film, or where it meets art, and what happens in those fusions at that interface, if you like. And most of my writing actually tries to place design in that way. I'm not really interested in writing about design in a vacuum as a thing in itself. I want to know what design contributes to some larger project which is of interest to me. It goes back quite a long way now. I did some academic research in the 90s, which was then published in 2001 in this book, which is about Typographica magazine. And then you've heard about Communicate in 2004 at the Barbican. I got the chance to do a big retrospective show about the last 50 years of independent British graphic design, so a chance to really immerse myself in this field, but drawing on things that I'd pursued and written about over the years, pulling it all together. And, okay, I'm blowing my own trumpet, perhaps, but I don't think there has been an exhibition in London dealing with design in this sort of broad brush, historical and thematic way since then, 10 years ago. So we may say things are getting better, but, I mean, there have been exhibitions, but this is in a major city gallery, getting the big budget and the full resources. This doesn't happen very often. We've had some monographic shows at the Design Museum looking at particular designers like Alan Fletcher or Robin Brown-John, but these sort of overviews are extremely rare. I mean, they should be much more common. Perhaps they will be in time, but we're not there yet. And I continue to pursue this. So I'm interested in magazines as a magazine editor, former editor and writer. So I've written about Motif magazine. We won't go into detail about that. There was a show about postmodernism at the V&A. So again, I considered the so-called big magazines, these large format magazines such as Blueprint and this one, NATO. Royal College, you've been hearing about that, loves to celebrate itself. 2 years ago, it had a big show, 2012, dealing with 175 years of its life, and that included graphic design. And I was commissioned to write an essay about very much a similar subject to the show Teal was talking about for the book there. You've even seen that picture earlier in one of Teal's slides. And on the back of that, I discovered quite by chance, although I'd been asking about them for years, a lot of Film Society posters in a drawer in the visual communication department. So I wrote a piece exploring that body of work, which was impressive and considerable and had been somewhat overlooked. Arc magazine, you heard about that too, published by the Royal College of Art. Again, this has been an interest of mine going back many years. I published an article by Alex Seago, who did a book about Arc magazine. I published an article by him in I 20 years ago now. So, these are threads that sort of run through all my writing. An anthology was published of the Arc writing, was published by the college, and I was asked to do a preface, just a short thing. But, I'm just continuously looking for opportunities to, as I say, put this sort of mosaic of commentary together. And then this is an example, really, of the way in which I'm sort of interested in things which are parallel and overlap with design, but are not quite of it. There's a concrete poet who was also a monk called Dom Sylvester Ueda. I was asked to write an essay for a monograph in 2012 because the editors heard that I was interested, and they were absolutely right. It was a bit of a dream commission. And see how it all fits together? The poster on the left was something else that I discovered while looking at the film posters at the RCA. It is an RCA poster for the monk Ueda giving a lecture at the RCA. So that was, these little moments, these are the moments of curatorial excitement where you think, no one knew about that. That's completely lost. No one's thought about it or shown it for 40 years, and here we are, 50 years, isn't it? We get a chance to bring it back. And now suddenly, I put this on the internet. These images are just out there. Surrealism and the graphic image. Yes, this has been quite a big thing for me. Long-standing interest in surrealism, going back to being a teenager at school, actually. I've always read about it, gone to shows, kept up on it, come to the Pompidou to see your latest blockbuster exploring some aspect of surrealism, really follow it. And at a certain point, I decided to write something about surrealism in the graphic context, because it seems very under-considered to me in the history writing that we've got so far. There was a big show at the V&A dealing with surrealism and design, and it just completely sidelined graphic design. So that's why I wrote this first article for I, trying to sort of map the territory a bit, and as there was more to say, I did a follow-up piece. Anyway, all of that led to the opportunity in 2010 to do this show, Uncanny Surrealism and Graphic Design, in the Czech Republic. one of the national galleries in their second city, Brno. That's the catalogue cover you can see there. You can't get that now. That's out of print, alas. In time, maybe we can produce something that's angled more towards the English-speaking reader. This is what just a couple of images to give you a sense of what it looked like. The presentation was quite straight. There wasn't much money for elaborate graphics and exhibition design. It was all about selection, curating, building themes out of examples. But for me, a fantastic opportunity to apply what I'd learned as an editor and a writer to the situation of, three-dimensional space and layout and explanation, of real objects in real juxtaposition with each other. I would do it again if the opportunity arose, but it's got to be the right subject. In some ways, this was a dream project. The only thing that could be better than this would be getting the chance to do this in Britain, or actually better still, America. That would be fantastic. But although it did travel on to the Netherlands, so it got 2 outings, this show. Oh, there's another image from it. This is the catalogue. The introduction took the form of a dictionary dealing with key surrealist concepts and individuals. Spread from it, you can see historical work going all the way back to the 1930s there, so it really was from the 30s through to the present. And another spread. The designer did a lovely job with the catalogue, really superb graphic interpretation of the spirit of the work and the show. And then, because the catalogue was out of print, I decided to just put the whole of the dictionary online. And that does seem to have found an audience. So reformatting it, small images rather than the usual big ones, more images, different images from in the original presentation, sort of fleshing it out and developing it. We're moving on now to online. And in some ways, this for me has, in the last 4 years or so, has been the critical new development. I just decided I would really embrace online writing, and I would try to use it for myself, for my own purposes, as a way of engaging with material that I might not otherwise be able to engage with, because I might not be able to find a print publisher that would let me do these pieces, but also the complete control you have when you can select the images yourself, maybe even photograph them yourself, assemble them, put them in whatever relationship you like to the text, so you are your own designer and visual communicator. And I actually, although there's not time to talk about that in any detail, for me, being a writer who is also thinks like a visual communicator, who wants to tell stories visually, is absolutely fundamental. I think it's kind of weird when design writing doesn't want to do that, or does it ineffectively, or the writer writes something, then hands the visual material over to the designer to sort out. Well, you may get a brilliant designer who can pick up the slack and do the job and deliver exactly what's required, or you may not. There are a lot of lackluster, poorly visually edited visual history, design history books out there. So, I'm saying maybe writers too need to think smarter when it comes to how to tell the story visually. So I've been able to experiment now for the last few years, and there is now quite a little body of work. I talked about this mosaic effect. You're just going to see a fraction of it that's online, and it's been extremely stimulating and revealing. And then I do articles which are spin-offs from the show. So you saw this project, you saw that cover image gallery by Bohumil Stepan from 1967, Czechoslovakian book. It's full of these kind of weird collages, so I did a piece about that. And then I tracked down another one of his books. This is almost an ongoing project. I've got a third book by Stepan, which I picked up a couple of months ago in the Czech Republic for a small price, which I might even write about this coming week. So that's a bit of a series. And then, strangely, I have to confess, coming here to Paris, in recent years, I just find myself drawn more and more to French subject matter. I mean, I come here quite a lot. I usually come here at least once a year. I am just extremely interested in French art, in French, some aspects of French literature, in French visual culture. We're all influenced by French theory to a degree. To me, it's just hugely stimulating. Also, a lot of this work that I am interested in relates back to the 60s, and you'll have seen I'm interested in British culture in the 60s, so it's quite natural to kind of hop over the channel and make comparisons with what was happening here. So this is a piece about Pierre Faucheur's design for Breton's Nadja, which I'm sure you all read in school. You know, it's a French classic if ever there was one. A really interesting book. And it's a kind of history, a visual exploration and part history of how this book has been treated visually by different publishers. Breton himself did a new visual edit for this later edition, adding pictures in and so on. So, you know, this is fascinating to me, and leads into my final section, which is about the book and other questioning objects, as I'm putting it. I recognize in myself as a writer that I have very much concentrated on work which has an experimental aspect or dimension to it. Now, it's not that I'm against the everyday. It's not that I don't think that we could write amusing, possibly even revealing pieces about detergent powder packages and, you know, or cornflake boxes or annual reports even. It's just I don't want to do it. It just doesn't interest me enough as a problem, as a subject matter to want to do it. I'm not going to go into detail, but there are all sorts of ways in which that is a profoundly difficult problem for any writer. It's fine if you're Bart, maybe you can pull it off, but if you're not, you might just be writing about a boring subject in a boring way. So, you know, it's problematic. I've been drawn to what would once have been called the avant-garde, the sphere of experimentation, and that applies, you know, across the visual culture and its manifestations that I'm interested in. Here's some more French book covers, some more Frenchness. You know, a lot of this comes just from being over here and walking around markets and so on, and things catch my eye and I start to get interested. Now, again, it's very curious to me, I must say. You know, when I started to look into this, I found that I couldn't seem to find French writers who dealt with this. But, you know, your Idée series is extremely famous, extremely important in cultural terms in the 60s. Through into the 70s, but I'm looking at the 60s books here. And these covers, they're photograms or sometimes solarization or techniques like photographing things through glass, as in the one on the left here, to produce this strange pixelated effect. Looks like a computer, but it's long before any of that. Anyway, these are all done by a man called Henri Cohen. And it turned out he was still alive. I would never have been able to find him, I don't think, if it wasn't that at some point in the past, he produced this rather strange set of philosophical propositions on a website. And I was doing endless searches, I couldn't seem to find his name, and then I found this, and I just thought, this could be our guy, and there was an email address, so I wrote to him. He lives in Burgundy, in Yonne. It turned out he was 92 or 3 when I got in touch. I don't know if he's still alive. I did a Google search to see if there was any news, and I haven't been in touch with him since doing this. He was thrilled and delighted and amazed, actually, that at this point in his life, in his 90s, anyone was interested in this stuff. So we did the article. It's not very long. You know, it was as detailed as I could make it at the time. Sent it to him. Yeah, I mean, again, it's in a spirit of just, let's bring this back and remind ourselves and think about it. More Livre de Poche there. Breton, more Pierre Faucheur too. I started to get really interested in the book covers he'd done. I know they're highly familiar to you and probably banal, but even so, you know, I can't find much writing about it. It's most strange that when I did write about it, I attracted this attention from France that in the end, Étape wanted to republish these 2 articles about Faucheur. And I was delighted, but also slightly sheepish and embarrassed because I thought, well, it's your subject, not mine. I'm struggling to kind of deal with I can read French up to a point, but still, I'm not the obvious person to do it. And there they were republishing for your benefit an English person's article about this subject. But I'm drawn to it, and I'll continue to do it. But obviously, I'm aiming these posts, these writings, at an English language audience that wouldn't know this work, unless they're Francophiles, unless they come to France, unless they're book cover fans, they won't be very aware of Faucheur's work. So it's sort of useful. And it's the one bit that Richard Hollis hasn't covered and doesn't seem inclined to cover. I don't think he thinks the covers are very good, which I think is odd, because some of them are really wonderful book covers. But it just left this sort of bit of research to do. Chris Marker has been rather big Chris Marker in London this year. He had a big retrospective show at the Whitechapel Gallery, and round about that time I thought I'm going to return to commentaire. I'd seen it years ago and was knocked out by it, the way in which Marker uses stills from his films in parallel with the scripts from the films in this book. And it's an extraordinary piece of experimental book design from 1961, which again doesn't, I looked to see whether French graphic design historians had written about it as part of the history of the French book. And I obviously could have missed something, but online I couldn't find anything. So I thought, well, what the hell, I'll do it myself. At some considerable expense, I obtained this reprint from 1967 of the original commentaire. Then the one was added because Marker published a commentaire too. I got hold of a French copy of Lettre de Sibérie, Letter from Siberia, his film, and made a comparison between the film image, my screen grabs there, and the use of the images in the book, and so on. And again, I've got to say, I actually do mean this in quite a modest way. These are just they're personal explorations. You always think, surely someone's written about this, surely someone has written about it in a deeper, more scholarly way. And yet, when I published that, it was immediately picked up by the leading Chris Marker website, which pointed people at it. And now if you search commentaire, it comes up as a top Google link. And I just conclude from all this that strangely, a lot of this material is just not being written about. Now, there may be reasons, I don't know, intellectual, ideological reasons for overlooking this, but I have to say I don't get it, and it just looks fascinating and wonderful to me, a lot of this untouched, unexplored material. I'm really interested, as I said, in photography and in the way some texts have incorporated, long continuous texts have incorporated photography in an integral way. That's what happens in this book by John Berger, who you know, and Jean Moore, the Swiss photographer. This is a classic, but I think it is back in print in America, but not in Britain, from 1967. So again, I was kind of studying that in some detail. And that's part of a whole body of pieces that I've done looking at this issue. At some stage I may gather to get them together and expand them in a visual book. It's quite possible. But at the moment, like I said, I can have an idea today, do my research, and post something a week later. And I don't have to ask any editor for permission, and it's not peer reviewed. There's no process of delay. It has the immediacy of journalism while contributing, one hopes, something to the cultural discussion. More French material. Fin de Copenhague by Asger Jorn and Guy Debord. This is my facsimile copy, which I bought here in Paris years ago. It's not the original, but in terms of the scans, it makes no difference. And again, anything 60s, countercultural, in this case, Les Événements, May 68, is absolutely inspirational to me. So this is a long essay I wrote for a Dutch catalogue for the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam called Utopian Image, Politics and Posters. So it starts with a discussion of the commodification of this kind of atelier populaire imagery. In fact, I describe how Paul Smith, the fashion clothing shop, was displaying an elaborate portfolio of these images in its shop window. Exactly the thing that the atelier said should never happen. They would not sell and commodify their own work. And here, just a few years ago, is what had happened. So I was talking about the whole process, the ambivalent complexity of our relationship to radical imagery, going into the history of GRAPHIQUE and so on. And so there's, there are only a couple more examples. There's loads of this stuff. I, almost didn't know which examples to pick. Again, this is a long-standing interest of mine. About 12 years ago, I was in Zagreb, and someone took me to a little exhibition of posters by Boris Buchan, who's absolutely kind of overlooked in English-speaking design circles, but he'd done these incredible conceptual posters in the late 60s, the late 70s. So yes, what I'm doing is bringing this into the public domain, but here's the difference from, what's happening on Pinterest, this enormous, relentless sucking in of everything visual. There is a responsibility here. Maybe it's now an almost an impossible task, but I figure if you're going to put something online, caption it accurately, give information, don't allow the image to float free in this decontextualized way, which we do see on Pinterest. I started experimenting with that, and I put a lot of things up. And I spent so long getting the captions right that it almost wasn't viable. It just reminds you, when you do the job properly, as you would expect, in any kind of proper publishing in a magazine or book, you have to get the details right. As soon as you apply that online, it becomes serious work. But Pinterest has been set up so you just grab, you take whatever lame caption comes with the thing, you overwrite the caption if you can't be bothered. I'm totally opposed to this kind of maelstrom of decontextualized imagery. So I'm engaging up to a point, I'm using the same medium, but I'm saying if we're going to do it, we have to do it responsibly so that, at least the bits I'm responsible for have information which is as correct as I can make it up there. So I think that's my last image. Again, same thing. In fact, the springboard for this was a couple of books about art of punk. There was also an exhibition on at the Hayward Gallery in London at the time, so I did a kind of big review piece. Lots of images, returning to some old favourites, some familiar pieces, but also adding new material. But really, as ever, just trying to interrogate the material in a critical way. And, I don't want to overstate that, but it's just adding a little something to the discussion, instead of just taking things, almost, to me it is moronic, I have to say, to just take everything as visual sensation, not caring where it comes from, just so long as you like it and you can assemble it as one of your favorites. This is kind of absurd. And I absolutely feel if we're designers, if many of you are designers, if we're talking about design, designers as people who come from this history must also act responsibly as custodians of the history. So it's really depressing when you see designers assembling great boards of decontextualized, captionless imagery in Pinterest or anywhere else, and there's an awful lot of it going on. Someone finds a book, in a market, and they just scan it all out. Here's some groovy East European illustrations I found. No information about who did them, nothing about the book, about the culture, about the context it came from. I'm saying, yes, let's show it. We have a fantastic opportunity to show it, but we have to add context. I think that's more than enough from me. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.